Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're watching this. I'm actually recording this early because I'm having a little holiday and I'm going to be away on my usual Wednesday time. But I believe I can have it put up on the air on Wednesday, and the same thing will happen the following Wednesday if all goes well. Now, today I'm going to be speaking around what the sword symbology in the tarot has given me. And of course, right away, I get a frog in my throat. It's been one of those mornings, so who knows what can happen. Took me a while to really figure out how the swords worked. And as always, and the one thing I absolutely love about the tarot is that it always gives you the answer. It doesn't leave you hanging. It always tells you how or what you need to do. Now, if you have been following this at all, you'll find in the wands there was 4 symbols, and then in the cups there were 3 symbols that kind of said, "This is, if you do this, life goes well." In the swords, which to me are problems and challenges, and I think that's very specific, really what we tend to do. I think we create far more from the problems and challenges that we have than just straight creating in our lives. The Ace of Swords is the answer. One symbol only. And basically it talks about an issue has come up in your life and you have a choice. You can choose to deal with it, or you choose to go into confusion and uncertainty. When I began to realize that, and I remember actually how it happened when it happened many years ago, when I realized that, I began to take more responsibility for my decisions and be in the moment more to say, what do I want to do here? Because I was a little bit like the second symbol, as you put your head in your sand and doesn't want to deal with it because you figure it's all going to figure out right. And if you will remember in the cup symbology, where the 3 of cups is the happiness, and then in the 4 it becomes stationary, and then in the 5 they all fall over and lose. Here, if you do not deal with what you're needing to deal with, and then you're denying your feelings, you're denying what you probably even think or feel. And so consequently, what ends up happening is that you are basically denying, maybe even using your imagination to some point, but just don't want to deal with it. And sometimes I find that working with clients is that the last thing they really want to do is look at things. And what that does, if you don't want to look at it, it ends up creating disappointment, which is our number 3 symbol. And number 3 symbol, when people don't like it when it shows up in a reading because it's a red heart with 3 swords through it. But what really one needs to understand is that disappointment comes from because we have expectations that are not based in reality. And so they crash into reality and we get hurt, we get sad, we get upset. But then always the answer. And the answer is in the number 4 symbology. In the number 4 symbology, it says, go within inside. It's a very meditative type symbol, actually. It's like a knight lying above one sword, but the 3 swords from the hurt is up on the wall. Well, I should say they're hanging up on the wall, and the knight has his hands folded, and sort of as he's lying down there, and it's got a beautiful window which has a communicational element between an adult and a child, but also a black line through it. I have known sometimes in readings that black line gets very big in my mind because I do teach that you always go where your eye goes, because that'll give you the clue or the key for that to the next symbol. The number 4 says the answer lies within you. You need to go inside. You need to figure out, what is this issue? Do you need to forgive yourself? Do you need to be more aware of what happened? What was that disappointment? What was the expectation you had and that didn't come into reality? Mainly because we don't look at it. We don't see it. We don't want it. We have this propensity to want things to be the way we want them. And when we have that, it's like setting ourselves up like Skittles to be knocked over in a way, to have things not work, rather than be flexible and work with how things go. And that way, sometimes you can get to your goal much easier because you're dealing with the circumstances that are there in front of you. Now, if you choose not to resolve those issues, then we move to our number 5 symbol, which is a man holding, yes, 3 swords. And he now has 2 more swords on the sand and 2 people walking away. It's a conflict card. And this falls a little bit into that defensive programming, the pattern that a lot of us have, and defending who we are, and we fight no matter what. We're going to fight for it. We're going to do what it is. And we really don't care who else we hurt, because we want to be heard, or we want them to see the way we see things. And because of that, it ends up in conflict. And again, tarot tells us how to get out of that. And that's with our number 6. Number 6 assumes the responsibility and works through the emotionality, because we're not just a mind, we're not just brain power, a mental power. We have this vast vat of emotionality, which is often the one people think is the cause of all the issue. And it's only because we don't want to deal with how it feels, or we don't really go inside and know. And here again, just as in the number 4, go inside, but here it's just assume responsibility and move through, and you will get to where you want to go. Now, one of the interesting things that I found in my life, as soon as I began to say I was sorry about things, things got easier. I probably was a little bit of a bulldozer in a china shop for many years, and just, I don't know how to explain it, except that way. And then I really began to find compassion, and I began to recognize humility, and I began to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry sometimes for things I just do. And also I found with it for myself was forgiving myself was really important, but also allowing others to know that I could screw up, and often did. Made decisions too quickly, didn't really think about others or the effect it may have on them. So consequently, what happened is, in assuming responsibility, my say problems and issues began to disappear a little more, go away. And I would do what I needed to do to get where I needed to go. Now, in the 7, it's like all of a sudden, the 5 from the conflict either raises its head again, or we got deviated back into an old pattern. And now we have 2 more from the 5. We now have 7. If you really like color, and based on the color of how these symbols have been put together, the 7 is the only one that has a yellowish background, which to me it says they're really using their head a lot more than anything else. It looks like he's stealing away with these things. And these can be guilt, they can be regret, they can be just completely not looking at where you're going and just making more and more issues for yourself. All of that happens within that 7 symbology. But mainly I tend to find that it talks about what do we need to let go, because obviously you need to let go of this. You're not even looking in the direction you're going in. And the swords are carried very poorly. It's very kind of dangerous. And so that leads to the 8, where in the 8 of swords, on one side of this woman who's tied up, obviously to a post, can't see the post, but that's how she's tied up, in loose binds and a big wide blindfold. There's 3 swords. Now remember, the 3 swords were the disappointment and hurt. And on the other side, there is 5, which is the conflict. Guess what? Math, 5 and 3 make 8. But in front of her is the river of life, like a few muddy puddles. But behind her is the castle of dreams, right there, right behind her. Now, this is a case, again, it's one of the things I see and I work with a lot with clients is action. What action are you doing? In this one, if she would just wiggle a little bit, she could get out of the loose binds. She could, and if she turned around, and it reminds me a lot of the 5 of Cups, where if they turn around, they'll see the castle of dreams. So often what we want is so close to us. But in our perception and in our narrow-mindedness and our, what do you call it, when we're kind of just, we got to have it the way we want it, we don't see. We don't see what's there. And so consequently, we end up feeling nothing is working. And that's what happens in the 9. I find the 9 of Swords comes up often because it's when you get overwhelmed. When you get overwhelmed, I see it a lot, actually. People are overwhelmed by all the things they have to do or what they're going to do. And it's a lady, well, it could be a man. A person is sitting up in a bed with their face in their hands. So it's kind of like feeling sorry for yourself. Poor me. They do have a lovely shawl over them with roses, which is desire and astrological symbols. And I like underneath the bed, there's a little frame there where one swordsman is being felled by another. And that's how you feel when it's like this. But I also find it's often when people's minds get to all the things they have to do and they feel overwhelmed by the amount of things they have to do. They may not feel sorry for themselves, but they feel overwhelmed. And when they're overwhelmed, they go basically into inaction. And so one of the things I do when I see this symbol, and it's an overwhelming one rather than a poor me one, is say to them, take the smallest thing and do it. And don't worry about the others. Just put them aside for now. Then take the next thing and do that. Because when you've got your mind overloaded with all the things that you have to do, it's like it depletes your whole energy. And not only does it deplete your whole energy, but also you just can't see how you can do it all. It's just too much. And the key is to change that and realize that you can go one by one, because if you don't change it, you end up in the 10, which is the end, basically. A man's laying on the sand with 9 swords up his back, 1 sword by his head. Interestingly enough, his hand is very indicative in this. The hand is the same configuration that the Hierophant is blessing the 2 prelates in the Hierophant, and it's also the same hand, which we'll see next time, in the 6 of Pentacles. Same configuration. Basically, I can get it. 2 fingers up and these 2 down with this. It's like a benediction. But in this 10 symbol, when I'm going to read, when this comes up in a reading for me, for myself or anyone else, what I do is look, where does my eye go? That's my basic rule of reading. Where does your eye go? And because behind the man, there's the river of life, and then there's some earth, the mountains, and then there's a new dawn, and then there's a black sky. So the dawn is coming up, it's new. And so sometimes this just means that right now you're in a problem. Oh yeah, and sometimes I find my eye goes right in the swords, knowing they're in the middle of everything. And sometimes they're in the water, and sometimes it's in the new dawn. And so it's like mattering, it's where I work time a little, knowing time. Is this person's close to the end of the cycle, close to when it's all going? It's because it really is the end, but actually it's the end of the problem, because it's going to resolve itself. And many of you, I'm sure, will notice that when you have an issue, if you don't deal with it, eventually it gets so big it actually resolves in some way. You may not like how it resolves though, because you're not in command of it, but it all kind of falls away in lots of ways. So I've always found this journey of the swords, more than perhaps even the other suits, always giving the way out, always allowing us to move in a different direction, always allowing us to resolve issues, because we will have issues in our lives. That's a given. I'm sorry. You know, we have little time. I always think we have times where everything is peaceful and contented. And then it's like, if we're not working with our lives, if we're not doing the goal setting, if we're not looking, what ends up happening, things begin to fall apart a little bit. And I know, because I've spent a lot of years telling people, oh, I'm perfectly contented, like I'm absolutely wonderfully contented. But in the 9 of Cups, I'm sort of going back to some of the other symbols. In the 9 of Cups, it's very complacent. And what happens with complacency, often the cups could fall off the shelf they're on. And so I have learned that I need to still be working in a direction of where I want to go rather than just be happy where I am, which is great. I'm happy where I am, and yet I still want to achieve this, or I want to do that, or I'm going to do this. So that there's movement. You cannot just be sitting still, and you need to have some form of movement. Anyway, and then of course we have the 4 court cards of the swords. The Page of Swords, remember pages are in more of the immature attitudes. He's got his sword raised and he's ready to swipe. He's obviously going against the wind, but in the sky there is a fish, which is an ancient Christian symbol, and it's 10, I believe it was 10 birds. And he's saying knowledge, change, and action is to watch that. But the knight is in full force. The horse it's rough ground too, and the horse is going crazy. And we've now only got 5 birds in the sky. They're being scattered, and he's got his sword upraised. And this is when we overreact. This is the people that overreact quickly. This is when we rush in with, you know, the old saying, rushing in where angels fear to tread. That's our Knight of Swords. Off he goes. And so often there comes an issue there. In other words, he's creating issues that maybe he doesn't need to have. The Queen of Swords is different. Both the Queen and the King of Swords could be said they're what I call defensive symbols, as is the Page. A lot of defensiveness, don't want to deal with things. But the Queen looks open. And this I find very often for people. They are very open until you go to get close to them. And then it's like, no, don't come any closer. Like emotionally or anything like that. They don't want that. So they want that distance. She looks good. She's got butterflies crown on her head. She has 1 bird in the sky. One of the reasons birds are in this suit is because this is the element of air and it deals with your intellect. But the intellect is how we respond more than thinking, which to me I put with wands. And so she's sitting there and she's looking very friendly, but that sword is right by her side, and you know could be utilized quite a bit. She also could be very determined as well. Now the King, there's no way about the King. He is very set in his way. His butterfly is encased on the back of his throne with 2 half moons, 2 birds in the sky, because he has a choice. There's something about the King I really like, in that the way the sword is tilted. And I have found that if you are very, what's the word I want to use? If you're very logical, this is not a person that you use emotion with. But if you are logical and give a logical explanation, they'll open up like anything. I remember very, very early in my career as a reader, I would often get men coming in for a reading, and I'd get the King of Swords and I'd get the Emperor, both kind of, you know, and I'd sit there and I would just do a little bit of numerology. And they couldn't figure out how I would know about them. And they would just open up, and they would be very, very easy to read because of that. Because logically, I was telling them things, and then for me, it was just simple number stuff, because I'm not a real numerologist. I follow the energy of numbers, yes, and I use it, especially with the birth date. But I would often just look at their name and talk a little bit about how they were based on their name, and open right up. And I think that's the beauty of the King, because he's not really stuck. But he will often come with the Emperor, mainly because of that whole defensive and not wanting to be moved. But he can, because he will be open to logic, where the Emperor is not always open to logic. You'd have to look at what else was around. So from learning about the swords, I create, and it's probably not, probably other people have created sayings like this, but I started to say it's not the event that's important, it's how you handle it. We've looked at this is 3, the 4th suit will be coming, but these are the 3 main ones of how we are responding. Because in the Pentacles, we look at how it manifests. And if we can know how we respond, if we know the basic pattern of who we are and what it's doing and how it's working, then we can choose to change it. And as I say, tarot gives us the way out every time. Sometimes when you're in the middle of something, it's really hard to know. And I know I've often got really upset over the years when I go, what do you mean I have to let that go? You know what I mean? And it's like, yes, you do. You have to let that go. And how come I can't have what I want right now? All these little things that go on in your mind that need to be let go of, as far as I'm concerned, but also the recognizing, how do we handle life when it, you know, the old saying, if you've got a bowl of lemons, make lemonade. But what if it's delivering the lemon? What if it's delivering the lemon and we are unable at this point to make lemonade? Or maybe we don't know how to make lemonade with the kind of lemons we're given. But the answer is just breathe and remember that number one symbol. What is it you want? What's the outcome you want, really? Often we don't say what we want or do what we want, which we saw in the cups, because we're scared of the consequences. But if we don't do that, the consequences are so much bigger, so much bigger. So I'm going to wish you a well in thinking about, if there's any issues in your life, what is it you could do differently? What is the decision perhaps you need to make about how to handle that? And remember what I was saying, by learning how to say I'm sorry and creating a conversation about that, or not, just saying I'm really sorry, it makes a huge difference. But always there's a way out. Always there is a door. And so I invite you to look for the doors, to find out where to go, how to go, just so you have a happy life, so that you can live in that beautiful contentedness that I've spent a lot of time in. So thank you. Until next time. Bye for now.